Hello, thanks so much for coming today to listen. My name is Gail Rapoport Levin, and I am the child of two Holocaust survivors. My parents were both in Auschwitz. Today I'm going to tell you the story of my mom's survival, and I will try to be as quick and brief as I can, since I know that we're up against the inaugural today. So I want to make sure everybody has a chance to be able to see that as well. So here we go. When you listen to music, what does it make you think of? Does it take you to a special time and place? Does it make you think about someone special? Does it lift your mood or spirits when you're feeling sad? Or does it get you pumped up about something you're about to do? Music is an important part of life and offers us so many things. And music was important during the Holocaust too. First off, there was no Netflix, actually no TV at all. Some camps played radio over loudspeakers, but what they did have were orchestras and bands. And the concentration camps used music for many reasons. They used music to keep up the pace for weak and tired prisoners entering and leaving the camps to go to forced labor. They used music as propaganda to give appearances that the camps were a happy and friendly place to be. Music was a distraction for arriving prisoners from what was really going on. Music gave officers and soldiers a mental escape after a hard day's torturing and killing Jews. Music served as entertainment for visiting SS dignitaries. And having an orchestra served as a means for camp supervisors to gain notoriety. The reason we started with all this information about music in the death camps is because Masha PIETRKOWSKA was a member of the women's orchestra at AUSCHWITZ-BIRKENAU. Masha was my mom. And why was music important to her? Music saved her life. So who was my mom, Masha? She came from a small city called BEDZIN, Poland, and she was the youngest of 7 children. She had 4 sisters and 2 brothers. Here you can see her parents, my grandparents, 4 sisters and 2 brothers. Masha was not yet born when this picture was taken. The youngest here is her brother Joe. He was the only other sibling to survive the war. My mom was born on March 23rd, 1923, to an artistic and creative family. Her oldest brother played the violin. One of her sisters was an artist. Her youngest brother Joe had a fantastic singing voice, and my mom played the mandolin. The family was deeply Orthodox religious. In those days, many of the Jews in her community were. You can see my grandfather has a long beard and wears a hat symbolic of an Orthodox Jew. And they were also business owners. They had a shoe factory and a shoe store that served all the members of the community, Jews and non-Jews alike. And boy, did my mom love shoes. She had hundreds of pairs in her closet. My mom spoke of a happy childhood. She was the youngest, and many of her siblings were much older, and some even married with their own children, but they spent lots of time together as a family. Her father died suddenly of a stroke when Masha was only 6 years old, and her mother died in May of 1939, just before the war started. So Masha went to live with her oldest sister, Gela, who I'm named after. She went to Jewish-based Yaakov school and then to public gymnasium, which is what they called high school. On the right is a current picture of her high school. And on the left is a recent picture of her home, where the store was on the first floor and the family lived above. She played sports and she used to love playing ball, and she played her mandolin. BEDZIN was an industrial town of 60,000 people, about half of whom were Jewish. There was a medieval castle and a large old synagogue nearby. BEDZIN had a town square and a business district with stores and restaurants. BEDZIN had lots of factories where products for Poland and across Europe were made because there were many trains that ran through BEDZIN. And they had neighborhoods with apartment buildings and local stores, just like the one my mom lived in. BEDZIN wasn't too far from Krakow, a major city in Poland. And it wasn't too far from Auschwitz, only about half an hour's train ride away. The Nazis moved into BEDZIN in September of 1939, followed by the SS Einsatzgruppen, who destroyed the old synagogue and murdered some 200 people. The location of BEDZIN made it very useful to the Nazis because its industrial heritage could service the war effort. It was on the river, railroads went through it, there were lots of factories, and they could make things there. Also, BEDZIN was filled with artisan Jews whose skills were enormous, and the Nazis could utilize them for slave labor. So the Jews worked in the factories, making goods for the war effort. My mom was a seamstress in the ROSSNER factory. The ROSSNER factory produced uniforms for the war effort. As you can see, there's a truckload of uniforms piled up in front of the factory. ROSSNER was not a member of the Nazi Party, but worked under the SS, like Schindler, and wanted to help the Jews. ROSSNER was very connected to members of the Nazi Party and to influential Jews who lived in BEDZIN. So he set up a deal where the Jews of BEDZIN who worked in his factory were entitled to protection with a special pass, a sort of insurance against deportation called a soder. Some 6,000 Jews worked in ROSSNER'S factory, and each were able to protect 2 additional family members. So 18,000 Jews were untouched through ROSSNER'S efforts. Alfred Rossner prolonged the life of my mom and so many others, and was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. In 1940, the Nazis did form a sort of Jewish district or ghetto in BEDZIN, but it was loosely guarded and the Poles could move in and out freely, making for lots of smuggling of food and other basic needs. So conditions were not as appalling as they were in other ghettos. But on August 3rd, 1943, all of the Jews left in BEDZIN were deported to Auschwitz, and my mom was on the 8th train that day. She arrived the very same day, August 3rd, 1943, because the train ride only took about half an hour. So what does that mean for Masha? It means that she didn't have to spend days traveling in a crowded cattle car with no food or water. It means that she didn't have to sleep standing amongst the stench of human waste and dead bodies. It means that she didn't have too long a time to fear for what was coming next. When my mom arrived at Auschwitz, she was placed in a selection line. Fortunately, at only 20 years old, and because things in BEDZIN weren't so bad, she looked strong and healthy and was taken into labor at the women's camp of Auschwitz-BIRKENAU. A little bit about the women's camp at Birkenau. The commandant of the women's camp was a very ambitious Nazi named Maria Mandel. They called her the Beast of Birkenau. Mandel was very eager to get ahead in the Nazi regime. She noticed that the men's camp had a big orchestra and that the Nazi soldiers and visiting SS dignitaries would often hang out there and listen to music after a hard day's torturing and killing Jews. She figured if she could put together a women's orchestra, the guys would be more likely to hang out on her side of the camp, and she could get recognition. So in April of 1943, she started an orchestra that consisted of both Jewish and non-Jewish political prisoners, most of whom were just so-so musicians that played instruments in their own hometowns. The conductor was a Polish music teacher. The orchestra was just okay and perhaps didn't garner as much enthusiasm as Mandel had hoped. But then, in the summer of 1943, a new prisoner arrived. This prisoner was a very famous celebrity musician, world-renowned for her musical talents. Her name was ALMA Rosé. And Mandel must have been beside herself having this celebrity in her midst, and immediately put her in charge of the women's orchestra. Alma Rosé was the niece of a very famous classical music composer named Gustav Mahler, and she herself was a virtuoso violinist. She was from Vienna, which was like music capital of the world at the time, and she toured all over Europe and America, so people knew who she was. But most did not know she was Jewish, as many Jews in Vienna lived a fairly secular life. So Alma Rosé gets put in charge, knows that Maria Mandel is really into having the orchestra be amazing, and gets to work whipping it into shape. But Alma also realizes that being in charge of the orchestra gave her the opportunity to make life in the camp better for herself and for the other members of the orchestra. First, she wants talent. So she starts to hold auditions, and she's pretty picky about who gets in. She gets Mandel to have the Nazis doing the selection help find her talented musicians. Next, Alma realizes that the orchestra needed to be awesome to make Maria Mandel look good. So she demanded that they rehearse all day long. In that way, the prisoners didn't have to do any other forced labor and stayed inside their block to practice, which meant they needed a place to play. So Alma requested the orchestra have their own block where the girls could practice. This meant that the orchestra had its own barracks for only 47 women, not a few hundred that shared all the other barracks in the camp. They shared a bunk with 1 or 2 other women, not 6. So the girls got a better night's sleep, and there was less chance to transmit illness to one another. The instruments needed to be, The instruments needed to be protected from the elements. So the block for the orchestra needed to have wood floors, not dirt, and a stove to maintain temperatures during the colder months. Alma even got Mandel to put toilet facilities in the block, so the girls didn't have to spend the time away from practicing, heading back and forth to the latrine. And since the women's orchestra was going to be playing for dignitaries, they were able to grow their hair, wear a different uniform, which consisted of a blue skirt and a white blouse, and get extra food rations so they didn't look so emaciated. Well, this is where my mom, Masha, comes into the picture. Masha has been playing mandolin since she was a child, and while she never played professionally, she was pretty darn good at it. So during selection, the Nazis asked for a musician, my mom raises her hand, and off she goes to audition for Alma Rosé. Alma likes what she sees and puts Masha in the orchestra. So here's the luck. My mom doesn't have to do hard labor, although ALMA ran a pretty tight ship. My mom gets to live in a block where there's only 47 women, not hundreds. Less chance of acquiring disease, better rest because there's less distraction. My mom gets to live in a block where there's wooden floors and a stove, so she's more comfortable during the cold winter nights. My mom doesn't have to go to the camp latrine, so she's less apt to get sick from typhus and other diseases at the camp. My mom gets to grow her hair, wear reasonable clothes, gets extra food, so she feels human and she has some dignity. And in return, Masha has to practice her instrument for 12 hours a day, play music on command in an environment filled with the smell of burning flesh in front of the men who are causing this, and at any time can put her to death at their whim. She was making music for her survival. This is a current picture of what's left of Barrack 12, where the orchestra lived and practiced. You can see the remnants of the wood-burning stove in the middle. The orchestra played and practiced 12 hours every day. They played marches at the gates every morning after roll call as prisoners left to go to their forced labor assignments. They played marches at the gates every evening as the prisoners, often fewer than had left, returned from their work. They played on Sundays at the commandant's villa so the guards and staff could party and dance the foxtrot. Germans had a passion for music, and the orchestra helped make the camp seem like a civilized place to work. They played when dignitaries came to visit the camp and to commemorate German holidays like Hitler's birthday. Sometimes they played when the trains arrived at the area of selection to deceive arriving prisoners into thinking that they did not have to face immediate death. They played whenever Maria Mandel wanted them to. But how did Masha and all of the girls in the band manage to do this mentally and emotionally? Play music, beautiful music, under such circumstances? For some, music was another form of oppression, while for others, it was a means of psychological resistance. I believe for my mom, it was an escape, a way for her to live inside the music rather than outside in the inhumane circumstances that surrounded her. There's a quote by a famous reggae musician named Bob Marley, who sums it up for me. One good thing about music, when it hits you, you feel no pain. Alma knew that making the orchestra great would be the only way to save her and the rest of the girls' lives, so she worked them tirelessly. Maria Mandel was thrilled with her orchestra featuring the famous Alma Rose, and she became quite popular among visiting SS dignitaries. This picture is apparently of some of the members of the women's orchestra playing a concert on a stage, as you can see the curtain behind them. The woman standing is Alma Rose, and I believe the woman on the far right is my mom. I'm not positive, but it looks like her, and the instrument she's playing is a mandolin. My mom told me she often played for the notorious Joseph Mengele, who was the camp doctor who experimented on Jewish lives. Other prisoners were envious of the band members' privileges, and it made for a difficult time mixing with the other prisoners in the camp. At least the orchestra members had each other and had Alma Rose. My mom talked of Alma as being her savior. Alma was looked upon as a celebrity, not as a Jew, by many officers and staff at the camp. They even invited her to their parties. At one such party in April of 1944, Alma took very ill and had to be rushed to the infirmary where she died at the age of 36. While not proven, it's rumored that she was poisoned, either by envious prisoners or by spiteful guards. Others say she died from botulism, from spoiled food that was served at the party. You know, there's a Jewish tradition that when someone who's close to you dies, you cut a lock of their hair for safekeeping. After my mom passed away and we were clearing out her home, we found a small envelope hidden with the name ALMA Rose on the outside and a small lock of hair inside. How she managed to keep this through the rest of the war and bring it to the United States, I'll never know. ALMA must have meant the world to her. So without ALMA, the orchestra was in turmoil and the members thought their days were numbered. A new conductor was put in place and the orchestra continued. But my mom said it wasn't quite the same without ALMA and their role dwindled. In October of 1944, the orchestra was dismantled, but Auschwitz as a whole was being dismantled at the time as well, since the Allies were encroaching and the Nazis were looking to get rid of the evidence of atrocities happening at Auschwitz. On November 1st, all of the Jewish members of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz were sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp via train car. Most other prisoners were sent on foot in what was known as the death marches. Bergen-Belsen was no picnic. There was no more orchestra, so there were no more privileges. And Bergen-Belsen was tremendously overcrowded. In July of 1944, there were 7,300 prisoners there, but by February of 45, there were 22,000. And by April of 45, nearly 60,000 prisoners were sent there. There was lots of disease, typhoid, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, dysentery, and starvation. Masha got there strong enough to withstand all of this for the 5.5 months she was there. In fact, nearly all of the musicians of the orchestra survived. The English liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15th, 1945, and set it on fire because it was so full of disease. They moved some 29,000 living prisoners to the Panzer Army camp nearby, which served as the Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp, a refugee camp. All of these young people were looking for family members and friends who survived. And since many, including my mother, came up empty-handed except for her brother Joe, they started looking for soulmates and to create a new life. They held dances, and at those dances, music was played. My mom, of course, was one of the musicians. One day, she was playing at a dance, and a handsome young man named Masha Rapoport approached her and helped her flip the pages of her music stand. They fell in love and got married and started a life together. Masha and Morris lived in Bergen-Belsen until 1949, when they received immigration notification to America and took the boat on over to NYC. After arriving in New York, they went to Hopewell, Virginia, because they were sponsored by some wealthy philanthropic woman that lived there, where my dad worked in a picture frame factory and my mom worked as a seamstress. Masha learned her brother had moved to Chicago, so soon after, they left and settled here. They lived in Chicago amongst other Holocaust survivors in the Albany Park area and went to school to learn English. My dad started a construction company with a couple other guys, and they saved enough money to build a house in Lincolnwood, where they settled in 1960, just as my brother was born. I came around a few years later, and we lived a happy little life on a tree-lined street in suburbia. My mom continued to play mandolin. On the left is the mandolin she played here in the States. She tried to teach me, but I was hopeless. She played for her friends at home parties and at events for organizations they belonged to. She played for residents of a nursing home nearby to where she lived. She sometimes even brought her mandolin with her to the hair salon and played while waiting for her curlers to dry. In fact, the president of this museum, Fritzi Fritzl, remembers seeing her playing at the salon. She played for her life. So that's the story of Masha PIETRKOWSKA Rapoport, my mother. 85% of the people sent to Auschwitz were murdered. My mother was one of the 15% who weren't. I think about what it took for her to get into that small percentage of people who made it through. I think of the determination and the will to survive. My mom was a very strong-headed person, didn't let herself get pushed around, and stood up for herself. I think about the people that came to her aid. First, she had Alfred Rosner, the factory owner in BEDZIN, and then ALMA Rosé, who really helped to keep her alive. And lastly, I think about all the luck that befell her, because without that luck, there's no way I'd be here speaking with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. You up for a couple questions?
Sure.
We do have a couple. One of the first ones is, did you, I think you mentioned that you were hopeless with the mandolin, but did you or your brother ever learn to play any instruments?
You know, I took piano lessons for like 7 years, and my brother played the flute for a little while, you know, tried. I also took violin, I think, for a while when I was in middle school, but it never, I didn't have the passion for it.
When did you first hear your mother's story?
I probably can't remember when I first heard it. But, you know, my mom talked about, you know, she talked about being a musician in the orchestra. She didn't talk about details of the camps, but she would talk about before the camps, and she talked about after the camps. I guess I probably, you know, came to the understanding that she was a musician in the orchestra probably sometime in my, you know, adolescence.
What happened to your uncle?
My uncle was in Chicago. He survived. He lived in Chicago. He had a few kids. He's gone now. And his family is in the Chicago area.
Right. And then what was it like growing up as a child of survivors?
It's a loaded question. You know, growing up as a young girl living on the North Shore, being a child of survivors was a challenging thing for me. Particularly because I'm on the younger scale of second generation, you know, kids of Holocaust survivors. And so I didn't really have many friends whose parents were survivors. And my parents were very overprotective because they were survivors. So it was a challenging experience, needless to say. But they valued education, and that was a really important thing for them. And they worked hard, and they gave my brother and I really nice lives.
When did you start sharing your family story, and when did you get involved with the museum?
Well, I am actually a docent at the museum. I guess I would be considered a docent in training because I was in the last class, the last training class that got interrupted by the COVID pandemic. So, you know, and then I was asked to train to be a speaker in this 2G Speakers Bureau, which I was very excited about. So, so I'm sort of embarking.
A lot of you know, praise for your presentation. So wonderful job there. One last question.
Yeah.
What is kind of a takeaway you want people to have from hearing your family's story?
Well, you know, it's interesting that this is the day that I'm telling my mother's story, because her story is from darkness to light, and hopefully this world will be moving in that same direction, especially this country today. But really what I think it means is that you know, the three things that I feel that she had. One was the will to survive, the determination to get through struggles and challenges in life that life puts in your way. Secondly, the fact that you can't do it alone, and that, you know, you need to help and you need to be helped when those things are facing you. And you got to have a little luck. So.
Brilliant. I will let you have the final goodbye to everybody.
Sure. I just want everybody to, I want to thank everybody for coming and listening. And please join us next Wednesday, January 27th at 10 o'clock at Central Time to hear second generation speaker Nancy Fertig share her mother's story of survival. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.